The morning it ended, the sky over Lake Ontario was the kind of pale grey that makes everything look temporary. Aldous Vane, 61-year-old chairman of Vane Maritime Holdings, stood on the balcony of the Harbour Grand Suite and held up a cream-coloured blazer that did not belong to him. He held it at arm's length, the way you hold something that offends you, and then he let it go over the railing. It opened in the November air like a wing, then fell 3 stories to the stone terrace below inside. Celeste Vane Okafor, 37-year-old wife of Kieran Vane, watched it fall. She did not say anything. She had stopped saying things in this family a long time ago. Karen was seated at the suite's dining table, his back to the window. He did not turn around. The woman beside him, Priya Sethi, 34, a junior acquisitions director at the same firm where Kieran worked, rested one hand on his shoulder, the way people rest a hand on something they already consider theirs. Aldous came back inside. He smoothed his jacket, looked at Celeste, and said, "I think we've all been clear enough about where things stand." Celeste picked up her weekender bag from the floor. Someone had already emptied the closet. The clothes she had brought for the long weekend were folded into a pile on the bench at the foot of the bed. Folded, not packed. Just moved, the way you move furniture you're waiting to throw out. She placed the blazer pile inside the bag herself, piece by piece, without hurrying. Kieran's mother, Ingrid Vane, sat in the armchair by the window with her ankles crossed and a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She had the particular stillness of a woman who had arranged many difficult things in her life and considered this one relatively minor. "You'll want to speak to a lawyer before anything is finalized," she said. "There are assets to consider." Celeste zipped the bag. "The suite is booked through Sunday," Ingrid continued. "You're welcome to stay the night, of course. We wouldn't turn you out." The words were spoken with the tone of someone offering an upgrade on a flight they had quietly overbooked. Kieran finally turned in his chair. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now finding the real version slightly harder than expected. "I didn't want it to happen this way," he said. Celeste shouldered her bag. She looked at him for a moment, not with fury, not with the dramatic, satisfying anger that the situation perhaps deserved. Just looked. The way you look at something you've spent a long time trying to understand and have finally quietly given up on. Then she walked to the door and left. Celeste had grown up in a house in Oakville where the dinner table conversations were mostly about shipments. Her father, Raymond Okafor, had built Coastal Ark Logistics from a single refrigerated truck he leased in 1989 into the largest private cold chain freight company in the Great Lakes region. Her mother, Diane, had kept the books for the first 11 years. Celeste had grown up folding invoices and learning what demurrage fees meant before she learned to drive. She was not supposed to take over the company. Raymond had always expected to sell when the time came, retire somewhere warm with Diane, and let the institution become someone else's problem. But Celeste had spent 2 years in Singapore, working supply chain for a multinational, returned to Oakville with a master's in logistics management and an instinct for infrastructure that her father recognized as something he hadn't been able to teach. She had simply absorbed it, and the retirement conversations stopped happening. By the time she was 32, she was COO. By 34, Raymond had handed her the title of CEO and moved to Florida. She had met Kieran at a harbor gala. He was confident in the particular way of men who had never had to build anything. Confident in rooms, in conversations, in social geometry. He worked in maritime acquisitions, which meant he evaluated companies like hers for clients who wanted to buy them. He had looked at her across a reception table and said, "You're Okafor's daughter," and she had said, "I'm the CEO of Coastal Ark," and he had smiled at that in a way she had then found charming. She had learned eventually what that smile actually meant. It meant noted. They married 18 months later in a ceremony at a winery in Prince Edward County. Ingrid Vane wore a hat. Aldous gave a toast about legacy and continuity and what it meant for 2 families in the maritime sector to be joined. Celeste's father, calling in from Palm Beach, had said, "You look beautiful, Celeste." And then quietly, so only she could hear, "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." She had thought at the time that he was talking about the first dance. She understood now that he was not. The first 3 years of the marriage were not unhappy. Or they were not obviously unhappy. Looking back, Celeste would identify the feeling as a kind of ambient tension. She had normalized the way you normalize the sound of a highway if you live close enough to one for long enough. Always there, never quite gone, simply reclassified as background. Kieran was attentive when he needed to be. He was good at occasions. Birthdays remembered, the right restaurant chosen, the kind of physical affection that performed love convincingly in public and in front of families. He had an instinct for when the optics of a marriage required maintenance, and he maintained them. What he was less attentive to was the part of the marriage that had no audience. He was dismissive of her work in a way that was always deniable. He called it the logistics stuff at dinner parties, with a half-law that was designed to read as affectionate. He introduced her as Celeste, who runs the family business. Not CEO, never CEO, as though the title were an inheritance she was minding rather than a company she was actively running. When she talked about contracts, about regulatory filings, about the expansion of the Hamilton distribution hub, he would listen with the particular kind of attentiveness that looked like listening and was not. She noticed all of it. She said none of it. She had been raised to fix problems quietly. Priya had started at his firm 14 months ago. Celeste had met her once at a company dinner, briefly. She was striking in the way people are striking when they have decided to be. She had laughed at the right things. She had looked at Kiran with the particular attention that Celeste recognized, later, as something she had once given him herself. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She thought about it considerably more when, in August, she found a hotel receipt in the pocket of a jacket she was taking to the dry cleaner. The hotel was in Montreal. Kiran had told her that trip was a solo client meeting. She hadn't said anything then either. She had simply begun to pay attention in a different way. The weekend at Harbour Grand had been Ingrid's idea. A family gathering, ostensibly. Aldous and Ingrid's anniversary suite booked for the extended family, a dinner reservation at the hotel restaurant. Celeste had driven up from Oakville. Kiran had arrived separately. From Toronto, he said, from the office. Priya had arrived with him. Not announced, not introduced, present. She had walked into the suite's living area with the ease of someone who had been there before, set her overnight bag on the chair by the entry, and kissed Ingrid Vane on the cheek. Celeste had watched all of this from the doorway of the bedroom where she had been unpacking. Ingrid had glanced at Celeste with an expression that was not apologetic. It was the expression of a woman delivering information she considered overdue. "I think," Ingrid had said, "we should all have a conversation." The conversation had lasted about 20 minutes. It was less a conversation than a choreography that had been rehearsed about her. Kiran had been distant and formal, which she understood now was guilt-arranged as composure. Aldous had been the one who spoke the most, as if the dissolution of her marriage were a business matter requiring a chairman's remarks. He talked about everyone's happiness. He talked about timing. He talked about the importance of handling things with dignity. At some point during that conversation, a folder appeared on the table. Inside it were divorce papers, already prepared. Kiran had signed them before she even sat down. She drove back to Oakville that night. The 403 was quiet. She stopped at a Tim Hortons near Burlington and sat in the parking lot for a while with a medium coffee she didn't drink. She called her father. Raymond Okafor picked up on the second ring. It was late enough that he would have been asleep. He did not sound like a man who had been asleep. She told him what had happened, concisely. She was not someone who spoke at length about her own pain. She had learned this from him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you safe? I'm in a parking lot in Burlington. Go home. Lock the door. Call me in the morning, Dad. We'll deal with the rest in the morning." She drove home. She unlocked the door of the house on Lakeshore Road, the house that was in her name, that had always been in her name, that she had purchased 2 years before she even met Kiran, because she had believed firmly in the principle of owning your own foundation. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. She did not cry. She was not in that moment a person who cried. She opened her laptop and answered 11 emails about the Hamilton expansion. Coastal Ark Logistics held contracts with 4 major port operators on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. It held the cold chain freight agreement for 3 of the largest commercial fishing distributors in the region. It held, in particular, a 10-year infrastructure services agreement with Vane Maritime Holdings, an agreement that had been signed the year before Celeste married Kiran, negotiated on the merits, and never renegotiated because no one at Vane Maritime had ever thought to. Aldous Vane had, in fact, once referred to this agreement as the Okafor arrangement at an industry dinner, with the implications that it had been a courtesy extended to a smaller player. He had said this within earshot of 2 of his own board members and the editor of a maritime trade publication, none of whom had corrected him. The agreement was worth approximately $4.3 million annually to Vane Maritime in the form of below-market priority processing fees that Coastal Ark provided as part of a long-term relationship pricing structure. The below-market rate had been Celeste's decision. She had believed then in the value of institutional goodwill. 3 weeks after the weekend at Harbour Grand, Celeste submitted a formal notice of rate revision to Vane Maritime's logistics director. It was a standard document within the terms of the agreement, citing the standard clause that permitted annual rate reviews. It raised the processing fee to market rate. The logistics director emailed back within an hour, asking if there had been an error. Celeste replied that there had not. The revised rate represented an increase of approximately $1.1 million per year to Vane Maritime's operating costs. It was not ruinous on its own, but Vane Maritime was not at this particular moment in a position to absorb $1.1 million in unplanned cost increases. Celeste knew this because she had spent 4 years attending Vane family dinners, listening to Aldous talk about the company the way men of his generation talked about everything, too loudly, with too much confidence, in rooms where they assumed no one was taking notes. She had been taking notes. Kieran found out about the rate revision through his father. Aldous called him on a Tuesday morning, and Kieran had called Celeste by noon. She was in a meeting when he called. She let it go to voicemail. His message was careful. He said he understood there might be some strain given recent events, and that he hoped they could handle things professionally. He said he was sure they could find a resolution. He said he didn't want things to be adversarial. He said, specifically, "This doesn't have to be about us." She listened to the voicemail, once deleted it, and went back into her meeting. The following week, Vane Maritime's logistics director requested an in-person meeting to discuss the terms. Celeste sent her VP of Commercial Contracts, a quietly formidable woman named Aurélie Marchetti, who had been with Coastal Ark for 9 years and who understood, without being told directly, that the meeting was not a negotiation. Aurélie reported back that the Vane Maritime team had been visibly surprised. They had arrived expecting to meet with Celeste and had spent approximately 15 minutes recalibrating their approach when she wasn't there. The logistics director had been polite but off balance. He had asked twice whether there was any flexibility in the revised rate. Aurélie had explained that the rate reflected current market conditions and was consistent with the terms of the agreement. The meeting had concluded in just under an hour with no resolution. The situation at Vane Maritime was more complicated than a freight rate. Aldous had, over the past several years, expanded the company's operational footprint in a way that looked impressive on a revenue slide, and was considerably less impressive when examined at the level of operating margin. He had acquired 2 smaller vessel operators at prices that reflected his confidence rather than their valuations. He had borrowed against the company's infrastructure assets to fund the expansion. The debt service was manageable as long as the company's major contracts remained stable. Celeste was not the only vendor who had contracts with Vane Maritime, but she was the largest single logistics provider, and she was the one with the most leverage. Aldous came to see her in October. He arrived at the Coastal Ark offices in Hamilton unannounced, which was the kind of move that worked well when the person you were visiting was intimidated by you and did not work at all when they were not. The front desk called Celeste's assistant, who came down to meet him. She offered him water, led him to a conference room, and told him that Celeste was finishing a call but would be with him shortly. He waited 22 minutes. When Celeste entered the conference room, she shook his hand and sat down across from him and asked what she could do for him. He said, "I think you know why I'm here." She said, "I'd prefer to hear it directly," he said. He felt the rate change was unnecessary and that it put the family in an awkward position. He said he hoped she could appreciate the sensitivity of the situation given everything that had happened, he said. And she noticed that he said this as though it were a point in her favor that he had always respected her father. Celeste said, "The rate revision is within the terms of the agreement and reflects current market conditions. If Vane Maritime would like to renegotiate the structure of the arrangement, we're open to that conversation through the appropriate channels." Aldous looked at her for a moment. "I'm the appropriate channel," he said. "The appropriate channel," she said, "is Aurélie Marchetti, our VP of Commercial Contracts. I'll have her office reach out to schedule." He left without finishing his water. Kieran came to see her 2 weeks later. He called ahead this time, which she supposed was progress. He drove to the house on Lakeshore Road on a Thursday evening and sat in a kitchen and looked at the room in a way that told her he had forgotten, or perhaps had never quite registered, that everything in it was hers. He looked tired. The composure that had always been his most reliable feature was beginning to require visible maintenance. He said, "I'm not here to relitigate anything between us." "Good," she said. "The rate change is affecting the whole family, not just my father. The company has employees. It has people who have nothing to do with what happened between you and me." Celeste set down her coffee. "The rate change is consistent with our contractual terms," she said. "We've offered to renegotiate the structure. That offer stands." "Celeste, Kieran." Her voice was even. "What happened at Harbour Grand was your decision. The rate revision is a business decision. I don't think those two things need to be discussed in the same conversation." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Were you always going to do this, if things went wrong?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I wasn't," which was true. She had not planned it. She had not filed the rate revision out of revenge, not precisely. She had filed it because she had realized, sitting in a parking lot in Burlington at midnight, that she had spent 4 years providing Vane Maritime with below-market pricing out of a sense of familial goodwill that had, it turned out, been entirely one-directional. She had, in the language of business, been subsidizing people who did not value her. She had simply stopped. "The offer to renegotiate is a fair one," she said. "I'd take it." He left without saying goodbye. The Vane Maritime Board met in November. Celeste knew about the meeting because she knew 2 of its independent directors, Terence Hadley and Viviane Owlette, from industry associations where she had sat on the same committees for years. She was not in the room. She did not need to be. What she learned afterward, through the appropriate channels, was that the board had spent a considerable portion of the meeting discussing the company's debt exposure and the impact of recent cost increases on their debt service coverage ratio. She learned that 2 directors had asked, directly, why the Coastal Ark arrangement had been structured as it had been for so long and who had been responsible for not renegotiating it when market rates shifted. She learned that Aldous had not had a satisfying answer to this question. She also learned that the board had engaged an independent advisor to review the company's major contract relationships, which was the kind of thing boards did when they were beginning to ask questions about management. She was not mentioned by name in any of this. She did not need to be. In December, Ingrid Vane sent her a card, a Christmas card, cream-colored, the expensive kind with textured paper and typed interior message. It said that Ingrid hoped Celeste was keeping well, that the season could be a difficult time, and that she had always thought of Celeste with warmth. Celeste put the card on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while. Then she put it in the recycling. She spent Christmas in Oakville with her parents, who had flown up from Palm Beach for the week. Her father barbecued despite the cold, which he always did, and her mother made jollof rice and her aunt's coconut cake, and her cousin drove up from Hamilton with her kids, and the house was loud in a way that Celeste had forgotten she needed. On Boxing Day, sitting on the back porch with her father, while her mother and aunt argued inside about something pleasantly minor, Raymond said, "How are you actually?" "I'm all right," she said. He looked out at the yard. The snow had come early this year, which everyone had complained about, and which Celeste privately liked. "The Vane thing," he said. "You handled it the right way." "I didn't handle it," she said. "I just stopped doing something I shouldn't have been doing." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say something. "Your mother always said you were too patient with that family. Mum was right." "Don't tell her that," he said. "She'll never let either of us forget it." The divorce was finalized in February. Her lawyer, a woman named Jonquil Frazier, who had been recommended by 2 different people and who wore the kind of glasses that made you feel safe about the contents of the folders she was carrying, handled it with a minimum of drama. The house had always been Celeste's. There were no children. Kieran had signed his initial documents at a hotel suite in November, and the rest proceeded, as her lawyer put it, in an orderly fashion. Celeste signed her own documents on a Tuesday afternoon in a bright office on King Street West, with a view of the financial district and a cup of tea she had been offered and accepted. She read everything before she signed. Jonquil waited without rushing her. When she finished, Jonquil said, "That's everything," and Celeste said, "Thank you," and they shook hands. She took the elevator down to the street and walked 4 blocks to a cafe she liked and ordered a slice of lemon cake and read 20 pages of a novel she had been meaning to finish for months. It was a grey afternoon, the kind Toronto did reliably in February, with the light that came off the wet pavement in a way that was almost silver. She thought about the blazer falling from the balcony railing. She thought about Kieran's back, turned to the window, the particular posture of a man who has decided not to look at something. She thought about Aurélie Marchetti's report that the Vane Maritime team had arrived expecting her and had spent 15 minutes recalibrating when she wasn't there. She thought about her father barbecuing in the snow. She finished the lemon cake. She paid. She walked out onto King Street, where the city moved around her with the efficient indifference of a city that had other things to do, and she walked to the parking garage, and she drove home to Oakville. In March, she received a call from Terence Hadley. He said the Vane Maritime Board was considering a restructuring of the company's major vendor relationships as part of a broader operational review. He asked, given her expertise in the logistics sector, whether she would be willing to join the board's advisory panel for the review process. She thanked him and said she would consider it. She spoke to her father that evening. She told him about the call. He laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind he produced rarely and with full commitment. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said I'd consider it. And will you?" She thought about it. The review panel would give her a formal seat at a table that, not long ago, she had been asked to leave. The irony of it was not subtle, but irony, she had learned, was not a strategy. Results were a strategy, she said. The company has good employees. They don't deserve to go down with the ship because the people at the top made bad decisions. Raymond was quiet for a moment. That's a very decent thing to say. It's also true. Those two things are allowed to both be true, he said. She joined the advisory panel in April. The work was what it was, tedious in some parts, interesting in others, the way most things worth doing are. She did not see Aldous in any of the meetings, which was an arrangement she suspected was deliberate and which suited her entirely. She saw Kieran once briefly in a parking garage in April. He was walking toward his car. She was walking toward the elevator. They saw each other from about 20 meters away. He raised a hand in a sort of half-acknowledgement, the gesture of a person who has accepted a situation without understanding it. She nodded, pressed the elevator button, and went up to her meeting. People asked her, later, friends, her cousin, a journalist from a trade publication who had heard about the restructuring and wanted a quote, whether she felt like she had won. She thought about the word. Won. I feel like I did my job, she said. That was the true answer. She had charged a fair price for a service. She had let the business run the way businesses run when they aren't being managed by sentiment. She had stopped subsidizing people who had concluded she was optional, and she had let the consequences of that be their own. She had not done it to punish anyone. She had done it because, sitting in a parking lot in Burlington with a coffee she hadn't touched, she had understood something she probably should have understood sooner, that the most expensive thing she had ever done in her professional life was make herself artificially small so that someone else could feel large. She had stopped doing it. That was all. The Hamilton expansion opened in September. The ribbon cutting was a modest affair. Celeste was not someone who spent money on ribbon-cutting ceremonies when she could spend it on refrigeration units. But her parents flew up, and Aurelie brought her kids, and a few long-time employees who had been with the company since the Raymond years came, and someone brought a very good butter tart from a bakery down the road, and everyone stood in the new facility in Hamilton in the early September light and looked at what had been built. Raymond stood beside her. He looked around at the rows of temperature-controlled units, at the loading bays, at the logistics software terminals where people were already working, and he said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You built something good." Celeste looked at what her father had started, what she had continued, what would now outlast both of them. "We did," she said. He squeezed her hand once, the way fathers do, and then he let go, and they went inside.